This is the WMAY morning news feed, and I'm Greg Bishop. If you need to get a hold of me, bishoponair@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and the like. But I connected with Ernest Herrera. He is an attorney with the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, and they filed a filing against the Democrats' maps last week, siding with plaintiffs who are Republicans suing Democrats for the maps that they passed back in June. Those maps were based off of estimates. They were based off of the estimates that the census put out, because every 10 years you get new census data, shows the shifting of population, and it's something that leads to lawmakers redrawing political lines. But there's long been concerns about politicians picking their voters and not voters picking their politicians. So based off of the estimated data, lawmakers, Democrats majority, they passed maps back in May. The governor enacted those maps in June, but they were sued. And then they came back just a few weeks ago to revise those maps after new census data was released. But even those maps, some say, has malapportioned. Again, I talked with Ernest Herrera with the Mexican American Legal Defense Foundation, and he laid out some of his thoughts about what's going on with the maps and in the courts.
Sure. So the overall takeaway is that we think that a court should be overseeing the redraw process at this point. It may very well be that the court signs off on some version of what the General Assembly just passed. However, our point in Wednesday's brief, two of our points are, one, that the governor still has yet to sign the maps, and two, even if he signs the maps, our case still needs to be decided in terms of the constitutional violation that was committed in June. There were maps signed that were wildly malapportioned, so much so that there was a 30% what we call maximum deviation, which means a difference between the largest district or the most overpopulated district and the most underpopulated district. And the Supreme Court has said that a case of malapportionment like that goes beyond tolerable limits. But our overall point beyond those legal points is that a court should be deciding that, how the map is drawn, after the court decides that there was a constitutional violation in June.
So this is Ernest Herrera, an attorney with MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense Foundation, and I chatted with him briefly late last week about the filing they had on Wednesday, more about that and their arguments in the courts challenging the Democrats' maps.
Well, the way that it usually works in redistricting cases when there's been a constitutional violation or a violation of the Voting Rights Act is that once there's a violation, you give it a shot back to the legislature or whoever it is. Maybe it was the city council or whoever was in charge of redistricting. So you give them a chance to fix it. So in this case, it would be giving a chance back to the General Assembly or whoever is supposed to be doing it at this point. MALDEF doesn't take a position on who that is supposed to be. But we will say that in this case, we think that the extra chance was already taken basically by it. And we think that the General Assembly tried to redraw it after the census data came out. And what happened was there's actually been a reduction in the number of Latino majority citizen voting age population districts. So Latino voter eligible population districts have that are majority above 50% have gone down from the map that was in place in the last decade to the map that was just passed in August. Even though Latinos were the group that grew by 300,000 versus the overall population shrinking.
So ultimately what he's saying there is even with the maps that they came back and revised a few weeks ago, it's still malapportioned and does not have as much Latino representation in the map as should be reflected by the most recent census. I've also heard similar arguments from African Americans who say that they don't have as much representation as is reflected by the U.S. Census. So this is an interesting case that is going to impact who ultimately is your state senator or your state representative. But one thing that's also fascinating is I asked Ernest Herrera with MALDEF he's over in L.A., so he kind of has a general idea of all the redistricting cases that there are across the country. And this one, it seems to be the first out of the gate. Illinois seems to be the first out of the gate to get something through, and he says that raises an interesting point about this whole story.
So, yeah, I will add that last point reminds me, they were first out of the gate, which you think, oh, that sounds like effective government. But redistricting, for it to be fair and effective and legal, often needs the input of people. Here, multiple groups, including the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, multiple community groups, nonpartisan groups have said this process was unfair. There was no notice given on the drawing of maps. There were no maps put out for public hearings ahead of time. And so people really had nothing to review. And the data that people were given was not sufficient to be able to analyze the maps unless you have really impressive technology set up. So at MALDEF, we do have the ability to analyze maps somewhat, but most community groups may not have that. And so normal people cannot have seen what these maps look like in a day's notice to be able to give their input on the maps. So that process makes it so that we have no idea what their thinking was behind these maps and how people might have felt about them. So being first out of the gate in this sense is not necessarily good, and in fact, we think it's part of why there was a potential violation of the Voting Rights Act in the August maps.
So again, that's Ernest Herrera. He is an attorney with the Mexican American Legal Defense Foundation, challenging the Democrats' maps that they approved back in June and then came back and revised just a few weeks ago. So we'll keep you posted on the very latest of that case here on the WMAY Morning News Feed. I'm Greg Bishop. Thanks for hanging out.